I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Avahi Sakatapulu, a psychoanalyst as well as an author, and Dr. Ann Pellegrini, professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at New York University, also a psychoanalyst, and they're co-authors of the book Gender Without Identity, which I am also excited to jump into and discuss a little bit today. I do want to first start by saying thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for
Really
having
happy to be here.
me.
Yes, and I'm happy
Thank
to
you.
have you. So I do want to start kind of broad and then get into some of the themes that are in Gender Without Identity that you discuss, your new book. So for a question that I guess both of you could chime in on because it is kind of more broad, is gender sociological? And then how is it different or similar to sex in that regard?
The how the sex someone was assigned at birth, right? And that gender we might sometimes use to describe, well, what is it exactly? What do we mean when we say gender? Is it the set of feelings? Is it how the body comes to feel to the person? I mean, it's in some ways, it's once you start trying to figure out, well, what's the relationship between these two things? Are they different? Um, it starts becoming harder and harder to define these things. We think of gender as actually not having a stable essence. We don't ourselves think about it as being rooted in biology, though it has something to do with the body. We think of gender as we want to push back against ways of thinking about gender. And here you could call it sex too, thinking about gender or sex as being, as it were, born that way. We think of gender as a complex becoming. And people may feel their gender to be one way or another at one point in their life, and then come to feel it in another way at another, that gender just is how it feels to you in that moment, which might seem like a really counterintuitive and almost like kind of abstract or murky thing to say. And I'm very curious how what Avi would say and how I'm sure to sort of like complicate further what I just said.
Well, you're using the word sex kind of like it could go in a couple of different directions. The one is kind of like what sex were you assigned at birth, and that's usually based on, a child is born, a doctor observes the child's body and makes a pronouncement, and that pronouncement is sometimes and ends up being accurate or right, and sometimes it's not. It has to do with what experience the child has of their own gender. But we can also think about sex in the relation to sexuality. And usually, like we differentiate like sexual orientation from gender identity. But these terms are both distinctive from one another, but also quite tangled with each other. One's kind of like attractions and one's experience of one's gender are not as separate as we might want to think.
Yeah, so Dr. Pellegrini, what are some of the common misconceptions that you hear revolving around gender and identity and these sorts of things, whether it be from those maybe who follow more traditional gender norms and just misunderstand the complexities, or even from someone who may be more open to them?
Sure. I mean, I suppose one common misconception, right, is that there are only two. We work with a binary model, like there are only two sexes or two genders, and here I think we could use the terms interchangeably. You're either a boy or a girl, and not only is gender here understood to be binary, one or the other, and the or is important, right? You're absolutely one, you're absolutely the other, but again, you're born that way. That somehow this gender is rooted in biology, the biology of the body. What Avi was talking about earlier when she said, not only when the infant comes into the world might the doctor pronounce it's a boy, it's a girl, but with prenatal testing, often the parent or parents will be told in advance what quote sex their child is, right? We don't even have to wait for the baby to come into the world for people already to be imagining and thinking about this little human to be as gendered, as having quote a proper sex, or will grow to have the proper gender, right? So that's the first misconception, that gender is only binary. But another is, right, again, that even if we start to pluralize and say that there are more than two genders, and numerous cultural systems have always recognized that there are more than two genders. There are, sort of cultural traditions, both historical as well as ongoing, right? But even if you start to recognize and pluralize, oh, there are more genders, we now have the terminology of non-binary, for example. We've long had the language of genderqueer. there's still the sense, well, is it rooted in biology? Is someone born non-binary in the way that someone would be understood to be born female or born male? So one of the misconceptions, certainly that Abdi and I want to put pressure on in our book, Gender Without Identity, is the idea that in order to explain, or when it comes to, let's say, non-typical genders or atypical genders, whether trans or non-binary, in order to explain or justify those atypical genders, we have to say, oh no, definitely born that way. It has to be biological, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that there's often the sense that either gender is natural, binary, naturally binary, or if it's different, where'd it come from? Lots of anxiety, right? And this is the sense of like how to explain what is different to us or what seems to be different to us.
I think that's very wonderfully well put. And kind of getting into some of the themes that were brought up in your book, Dr. Sakatopoulou, one of the things I know you guys discuss, and I would love to get your take on here, is how trauma can play a role in forming or shifting gender identity. Could you kind of explain that? And then does this at all, I guess, change the way we should respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question, because we usually culturally, we'll tend to think about trauma as like this kind of like the set of terrible things that happen to us and that then break us or disrupt us. And then kind of like the goal is always to get back from that and to come back to where you were before being traumatized. But one of the things that I mean, look, this way of thinking about trauma, which is very, very popular, and it also kind of like puts in motion in a lot of both businesses, technologies, therapeutic practices about healing, repairing, fixing, kind of like you hear like many different of these words come up, kind of like are all organized around the idea that there is a self before trauma that gets kind of like broken or disrupted. But this, of course, only works for some subjects and not others. So for example, kind of like racialized subjects do not have a before to racial trauma to which they can never, quote unquote, return. Part of the pressure that we're putting on in the category of trauma, kind of like we talk about what we call traumatophobia, which is kind of a fancy word of talking about how this idea that the only way to relate to trauma is to try to fix it or return to something or imagine that there is a pre that the subject belonged to, that you can take them back to, that is both fake, like it doesn't actually work that way. Those of us who are clinicians know that nobody ever returns to who you were before trauma. It just doesn't happen. You may want it, somebody may want to give it to you, it's just not available. But also it is actually really conjugated through kind of like whiteness and the idea that there is a state that is unbroken, uninterrupted, kind of like untraumatized, and we should all strive for that. Like it also like chimes with disability politics, like the idea that there's an intact subject, nobody should have anything that is kind of like deviating from the norm or for kind of like full coherence. So part of what we tried to do in the book is to say that, you know, it goes back to the question you were asking earlier about kind of like myths or misconceptions about gender. Like one such myth is that your gender is what it is, and it's unaffected by anything outside of you. Kind of like this very kind of like liberal kind of like story of like full interiority, independence from the environment, independence from culture. Like your true gender is what it is. If it's affected by anything outside of you, maybe it's contagion, maybe you caught it somewhere. These are the transphobic models of our time, right? Or maybe you kind of like you were traumatized somehow. And if we can fix your trauma, you can go back to kind of like, you know, quote unquote, normal gender, which is supposed to be like binary and stable. So we say actually, and we have a lot of kind of like, we flesh this out in the book in quite a bit of detail to show how it is possible to think about gender as actually being quite responsive to the environment, including experiences of trauma. And that gender, not just variant genders, not just transness or non-binary gender or genderqueerness, but all genders have something to do with trauma. It's part of how they come together. And we give various examples of that in the book.
And that was, I think, one of the points that was really intriguing to me, and I think could be for a lot of people, and things that I think people can overlook pretty easily. Another one of the interesting points that I thought you guys brought up in the book was the lack of trust at times in the field due to, I think, what you described as rampant transphobia in psychoanalysis just as a whole, or in the anxiety that these analysts can feel in treating atypical gender patients. And sorry. So the question that I had, and either of you can answer this because I'm sure you probably have your own ways of working through it, But what are some of the ways or the methods that you have to work to undo this, not just in the field itself, but in the fear that a patient might have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in first, and then Abdi will have a lot to say as well. I mean, maybe I'll just back up and pick up something that you just sort of pulled out, Brandon, that there's a lot of suspicion, if not hostility, justifiable to psychoanalysis on the part of queer and trans people, because unfortunately, psychoanalysis has blood in its hands. It's not, and this isn't just about history. In an ongoing way, psychoanalysis has unfortunately made things much harder both for queer people and trans people, and especially, I would say, for trans people in the present. There are organizations which present themselves to be scientific organizations, medical organizations, that are, I think, actively working against the very possibility of trans existence and trans flourishing. And one of these, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, this is an organization that's actually headed by a psychoanalyst. Many of the people who participate in it are psychoanalysts, psychologists, psychiatrists, and the kinds of scientific papers this organization puts out and others like it then get cited and picked up by legislators and by judges when they're producing anti-trans legislation and anti-trans judicial opinions. So this is what I mean by saying that psychoanalysis, some psychoanalytic practitioners in an ongoing way are making it hard just for trans people to exist, let alone to access the healthcare that they deserve, right? That everyone deserves, as I think is a human right, right? So this is, given that, one could well understand why so many queer and trans people would wonder what psychoanalysis could possibly have to offer them, given that not just history, but ongoing present.
And did you want to jump in as well, Afi?
Yeah, I'm just going to go a little bit to your question, because when Anne says that kind of like, in our opinion, psychoanalysts have been at the leading edge of kind of like organizing this transphobic energies, like this can also happen in the consulting room. It's really important. This is something actually that I've learned from Anne's work together with Janet Jacobson, that, we have this category of like kind of like thinking about hatred. And maybe Anne, you'll want to jump in saying something about that, but like this is something that I've learned from you, that we tend to think of these people as kind of like being filled with hatred, and sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's all kinds of other instrumental reasons why kind of like somebody might be transphobic or ableist or kind of like homophobic. Homotransphobic is a word that we use to kind of like pull the two together. But no matter what somebody's intentions are, the effects can be that their work can be harmful. And what we're interested here are effects. So you were asking, like, how does one undo this? Like, unfortunately, it's very hard to undo somebody's commitment to prove that most people whose gender is non-conforming are somehow deluded or are somehow misunderstanding themselves or are somehow traumatized by something. And they have this kind of like false consciousness, right? You can't talk yourself out of a false consciousness argument. But the thing is, and kind of like I feel pretty strongly about this, we don't have to keep either debating or engaging with people whose opinions are harmful to populations we care about. We really don't. Like, we can leave them behind, but we do have to educate ourselves and educate each other about how to recognize them and avoid them. Like, many of them use the language of gender exploration, which sounds extremely encompassing. And I mean, who would not want to explore? I mean, what psychotherapy does is explore. But underneath those kinds of terms, and I'll put terms in quotes, kind of like are covered over all kinds of other agendas that are not helpful. So rather than work to help them change their minds about things that they're not interested in being educated about, I'm more interested in kind of like caring for our communities and making sure that kind of like people who are exploring their gender, who are getting to wonder about their gender, who have made decisions about their gender and just need support, do not end up in situations where they are they have to kind of like fight professionals who oppose them.
And this is also the good news. There's a growing number of us, clinicians, as you mentioned in your introduction, both Avi and I are practicing psychoanalysts. We're also both teachers. but there's a growing number of us, like clinicians who are committed to queer and trans flourishing, clinicians who are themselves members of the queer and trans community, as Avi and I are, but there are other clinicians like us who are fighting to make a space to work with people who want to come and have not just a space that will be affirming. We do believe in dignifying how our patients understand themselves and giving them space in that sense that is affirmative, but to provide a space that is not just affirmative, but a space in which people get to ask their own questions about themselves. The questions that get asked are not mine, right? I'm not telling people what to ask about themselves. I'm trying to hold open a space where people can become curious about facets of their experience, including facets of their experience that may have been painful or things they may have felt shame about. Are they allowed to feel this way? Are they allowed to think this about their gender? Or are they allowed, for example, which is something that Avi and I have definitely heard from our own patients, are they allowed to wonder if there's some kind of a connection between actually a traumatic thing that's happened in their past, maybe some experience of abuse, and their transness? And if there is some kind of a connection between something bad that happens to them in the past, some trauma, again, something like abuse, and their transness, does this mean they're not really trans? We want to hold the space where people, again, can be profoundly curious about themselves, to ask these questions and not have it have to cancel out their experience, right? This is a way of potentially even deepening their experience or making their gender feel more like their own, more livable, more lush and inhabitable. And to say lush and inhabitable doesn't mean there won't still be pain and suffering, because there's no human life without pain and suffering. We'd like there to be less pain and suffering, to be sure. But to erase that is a little bit, like it's basically adding far too much sugar to that lemonade we're making.
And that is a very amazing and important work to do. I think everyone deserves spaces of validation and affirmation and not being left out in the way that, sadly, historically, lots of minority groups in America have been. And part of the book also, you speak of, I believe, a child that was dealing with being gender nonconforming. I think it was Dr. Sakatapulu who spoke to their parents in the book, if I have that correctly. So the question that I want to pose to you is kind of, what kind of effects can you see a parent having on a child in this way through their own anxieties or even invalidation? And then in your opinion, what would be the quote unquote right way for a parent to respond?
This is such a crucial question, like for all parenting, but especially when you're parenting a child kind of like that the world mostly does not want. And I think that this is one of the things that parents need to understand about both their gay children, but especially their trans or gender nonconforming children, that their children are growing up in the world that is kind of like it's not like they can't find places of solidarity or community or pleasure or connection or even happiness. But for the most part, minority experience is something that is met with sometimes hatred, sometimes oppression, sometimes discrimination. So the first thing you want to do if your child is gender nonconforming, especially if your child has taken the huge leap to talk to you about it, is to preserve your bond with your child. This never means like anything goes. Like oftentimes, like people who are kind of like really antagonistic to trans childhoods will say, well, this way children control their parents. I mean, parents minding their relationship with their kids is just part of what it means to be a good parent. It's not to be blackmailed by your child, but it is to listen to your child, to what your child needs, to what their fears are, to what their wishes are, to what their desires are. I'm thinking of the work by Catherine Bond Stockton, kind of like writing about the queer child growing up sideways, by which she means that kind of like queer children are never given the dignity of their experience of themselves as they are growing up. It's only we want adults to be saying, well, I always felt this way. It gives adults a sense of kind of like reassurance when they hear, well, my kid was like that from the beginning. She was always like that. She was always playing with kind of like dolls. Like we thought she was a boy, but it turns out she was always this way, right? Adults like these kinds of stories. Legislators, therapists, kind of like policymakers like these kinds of stories. But what if we allowed children to have whatever experience they have at the time that they have it, and to make whatever identity claims they're making as they're experiencing things without expecting them to grow up first and then have the maturity or the kind of like the brain maturation, the emotional maturation to say something and only trust them then. Like, and this connects with many ways in which parents disbelieve their children when children report experiences of abuse or report experiences of having been bullied. Obviously, childhood and all psychic life is complicated, but like the thing that I think is most important for parents to keep in mind is how to be, you want to be on your child's corner.
Yeah, I think that's important with all facets of parenting, something that a lot of parents also overlook. With these next couple questions, I want to kind of zoom out from the book and address, in my opinion, what are pretty disgusting talking points that go around when these things get discussed, because, you know, I have the experts here, so might as well ask them their opinions on these things. And I guess since Dr. Sakatapulu took the last question, Dr. Pellegrini, I'll have you answer the first one. Which is, it's kind of these questions that I think should be rather obvious in their answers. But again, I mean, I think people are purposely obtuse with some things that they want to disagree with and be contrarian on. And it's a question of this notion that parents can force their kids to be gay or force them to be trans or force them to kind of feel these types of way. In your experience, is there any credence to this?
No, that's the short answer. And here is the evidence for why parents cannot, for a parent or a teacher. I mean, think about, you know, like when Florida's notorious "Don't Say Gay" law, right? Which, like, the idea that if a teacher in a classroom just discusses trans or queer issues, that somehow magically that child was going to be queer or trans. I wish I had the power. You know, I'm also a full-time college professor, and I've been teaching queer theory for years and years and years. I mean, is my magic wand for me to say homosexual and poof, I've accomplished it? I mean, what amazing power I have! But the proof that a parent cannot force a child to be queer or trans, that a teacher cannot do that, is that it turns out that a parent who expects their child to grow up to be heterosexual, and a parent who expects their child to grow up and be, you know, normatively gendered, or what sometimes gets called cisgender now, is often surprised when their child comes out as gay or comes out as trans or comes out as non-binary or bi, right? That in fact, children often grow up to become people that their parents weren't anticipating. So if parental force could be what produces a particular outcome, whether it's trans or cis or queer or straight, then anything a parent wanted would happen. And we just know that's not the case.
So then, Dr. Sakatapulu, I'll ask you the next one. And again, I apologize beforehand for the questions that I think are rather obvious in their answers. Just want to get these out of the way. It's kind of in the same breath as that question. Is there any ethical way for a parent, teacher, whatever it is, to prevent a child who is feeling gender atypical from feeling that way or experiencing these things?
No, there isn't. I mean, not only is there not an ethical way, there is no way. The only thing that these kinds of interventions or parenting techniques or even conversion therapies succeed in doing is in crushing people's spirits and perhaps forcing them to hide themselves from their environment, from their peers, sometimes even hiding themselves from themselves, such that they kind of like so many lives have been destroyed by these kinds of quote unquote treatments that kind of like have as their aim to change somebody's sexual attraction or to change somebody's gender. And very sadly, like the way in which kind of like people will lose their spirit and become very pliant and passive can then be read mistakenly as somebody's sexual orientation having changed successfully or somebody's gender having been changed. But it's impossible to do that. The only thing that you can do is destroy somebody's self-esteem, destroy their relationship with their body, their relationship with their sexuality, cause shame, insecurity, and ultimately destroy your own relationship with them and their trust in adults, their trust in caretakers.
And I think it's especially harmful when you're doing that to someone who's at the age where they're developing all of these things. You know, it has much more drastic long-term effects. The last question that I wanted to ask you guys, and I would love to get both of your takes on it, because I think it's a really important one, is, and it's a pushback against the kind of, you hear a lot of people will say, well, I'm okay with this. I'm okay with these people existing, but, you know, why do they have to shove it down our throats and these kinds of things, you know, like, why is it in schools? Why are they in movies? Why are they in books? Whatever the talking point is for that person. I was curious if you guys could explain, in your opinions, why you think this sort of representation is actually important and needed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is that the reason that there are trans people on television, and not just as the characters who are always doomed to die, right? Or that you might encounter, might be a fictional queer character in a book, is because trans and queer people exist, and we have representational forms which are, well, straining. They don't always do well. Straining to take account of actually not just the people in the world, but also, one of the things that's really amazing about aesthetic forms is they can imagine beings yet to be, right? So that there's something about them that's not just about the way things already are, but like they can actually open up a space for other things to emerge. I mean, I suppose I have sometimes my own concerns about an over-reliance on representation, because we can have, and we certainly do now have, positive, what we could call positive representations of queer people and trans people. Again, it used to be there was a queer or trans character, they were the villain, or they were going to be the victim, or maybe both, right? But it never ended well. So we have more quote unquote positive representations. But the increase in these representations, and this I think is part of the question you asked, has actually led in some instances to a backlash. Why are these people, shoving this down our throats? Why do they make us have to, why do we have to see this all the time, right? So this increase in representation can lead to a backlash, and it can also do this other thing. It can deceive us into thinking that more progress has been made than has been made. Because having a character in a TV show is not the same thing, for example, as full civic equality. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not the same thing as freedom.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Avi?
Yeah, I'm just going to flesh out something that Anne kind of was speaking about, which is that we do have right now representations of trans people in the media whose politics, even, or the way that they speak or exist in the world, even around transness, are harmful to trans people. Kind of the same goes with any kind of minority category. We have to get away from imagining that identity itself will get us out of problems of oppression or discrimination. At the same time, part of what I hear you say, the question that I hear you ask is, what about people who just don't want to see that? And I would say the word does not belong to straight people, and it does not belong to cis people. The word belongs to everyone. And people who are imagining that they get to say, it's fine if they exist, just not in front of me, whether they realize it or not, are commanding a sense of the world that belongs to them and which should abide by and conform to their own fantasies of what the world should be. And that is ethically problematic, whatever the minoritarian category we're talking about. So I find myself feeling extremely concerned about the ethics of even that statement. If you don't want to see something, you need to wonder why it is that you need to regulate others and try to control others as a way of managing something in yourself. That is what needs to be looked at.
And you both brought up some really wonderful points. The point I always try to push on my channel is I think it's an overlooked privilege by a lot of straight and cisgendered people, where they get to wake up and every day see people that are like them. They have books with people like them in it. They're the main characters in movies. And that kind of gives an unconscious sense of validation that for the longest time, gender atypical people didn't really get to have. So I think that the representation serves a purpose, but I do think you also bring up a lot of good points about how there can be backlash from this as well. So that was my last question. I did, however, before we wrapped up, I want to give you guys both the floor. One of you can take it. You guys can both say something to definitely shout out your book, where it can be found, these types of things. And then if there's any last points you want to drill home as well.
I can let Anne close. I'll just say very quickly, this idea that what you were saying, straight people feel like they only see themselves, and cis people, I mean, I think we also need to be very aware that there's many people around us who are gay or who are trans and who are non-binary and who kind of like pass as a different category, such that the world might actually be more impoverished in the eyes of somebody who's normatively gendered and who is straight. It may not be as straight as they think. So think about kind of like how many authors are now being discovered as having been gay. Gay people read these works and they kind of know. They know by the intonation of how somebody speaks or how they speak about bodies. There's all kinds of like codes and code switching that happens between different ways of communicating with kind of like within your community and outside your community. So even that kind of like very powerful impression that many people kind of like cis and straight people have, that the world is just made of them and for them, is kind of like is often mistaken before even a visibly cis or trans or non-binary or gay person walks onto the scene, whatever visibly means.
I find myself thinking of the black and white portion of The Wizard of Oz and the Technicolor. That's for the queers, right? You get to see so much more. But thank you for asking about our book. So Gender Without Identity is available as a paperback, and you can also, and it's also it's available as an ebook, which will be available soon, also on Amazon. But you can order it through bookstores. It was published by a small independent press. You can buy it directly from our press, Unconscious in Translation, or you can buy it from any number of other online and brick and mortar bookstores, and support your independent bookstores, please.
Yeah, and I always like to say for anyone watching, if you were interested in the themes discussed in the book and what we talked about, I will reach out to get a link for the book, and I'll have that in the description so you can check there for it. And again, Dr. Ann Pellegrini, Dr. Avihi Sakadapulu, thank you for such an interesting conversation and for sharing your expertise with me for a little bit.
Thank you. These are great questions and wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yep. And I hope both of you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
You too.